The laughter started before he even finished speaking. It wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. It was the kind of casual, dismissive laughter people used when they'd already decided you were harmless, when they didn't feel the need to argue because the outcome was obvious. A few smiles around the table. Someone leaned back in their chair, another checked their phone. Samuel Price stood at the front of the small conference room holding a rolled-up bus route map, its edges worn thin from years of folding and unfolding. He was black, 51, wearing his transit-issued jacket even though he'd been told this was a casual internal meeting. His hands were steady, his voice was not. "I'm just saying the numbers don't line up," Samuel said. "The routes they're cutting are the same ones getting rerouted through private contracts. And the timing." A man from City Transit Administration interrupted him with a chuckle. "Sam, you drive a bus." The room laughed again, softer this time, like punctuation. Samuel nodded slowly, as if accepting a correction. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then maybe let the planners handle planning," the man continued, still smiling. "These decisions are bigger than what you see from behind the wheel." Samuel felt heat rise in his chest, but he didn't raise his voice. He never did. 30 years driving city buses had taught him that volume didn't equal authority. Clarity did. "I see the same streets every day," Samuel said. "I see which stops lose service and which ones suddenly get outsourced. I see construction that never finishes and detours that don't make sense. I started marking it." That was when someone actually laughed out loud. "You made yourself a little map?" another official said. "That's dedication." Samuel didn't respond to the tone. He unrolled the map on the table anyway. It was a citywide transit diagram, bus routes, stops, maintenance yards, but layered with his own markings. Red ink, blue lines, dates scribbled in the margins, small symbols only he fully understood. The room barely glanced at it. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. "Thanks for your input, Sam," the administrator said, already standing. "We'll take it under advisement." They didn't. Samuel rolled the map back up and left the building, walking past framed posters celebrating transparency in public transit and community engagement. Outside, the air smelled like rain and exhaust. His bus waited at the curb, engine humming patiently. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Samuel exhaled slowly. This wasn't the first time he'd been laughed at. He'd been laughed at when he started keeping notebooks, recording route changes that didn't appear in official memos. Laughed at when he noticed that certain private shuttle companies always appeared on corridors right after public routes were reduced. Laughed at when he asked why maintenance budgets were slashed on lines serving poorer neighborhoods while pilot programs popped up elsewhere overnight. "You're reading too much into it," they'd told him. So he stopped talking and started mapping. Every detour, every temporary suspension that became permanent, every contract announcement that lined up just a little too neatly with service cuts. Samuel didn't have access to spreadsheets or internal emails. He had time, he had repetition, he had patterns. Night after night, after his shift ended, he spread the map across his kitchen table. He used different coloured pens, one for public routes, one for private contractors, one for construction zones that never existed on the ground. He overlaid dates, compared announcements to reality. The picture that emerged was ugly. Routes weren't being cut because of low ridership, they were being cut to make room. Private companies, owned by shell corporations, were stepping into the gaps, charging the city inflated rates to provide temporary service. Service that never went away, service that someone, somewhere, was getting rich from. And it all ran through the same few corridors. Corridors Samuel drove every day. One evening, while parked at the end of his route, a college student boarded late and asked, "Why'd they change this line again? It makes no sense." Samuel looked at the empty bus, then at the map tucked into his bag. "It makes sense to somebody," he said. The student laughed. "Yeah, probably not us." Samuel didn't laugh back. Because the thing about being laughed at long enough is that you stop trying to convince people you're right. you start collecting proof instead. They had laughed at the bus driver because they thought his world ended at the steering wheel. They didn't know yet that his route map, built mile by mile, stop by stop, was already outlining a story they would soon be forced to explain. And once that map was seen by the right eyes, no amount of laughter would be able to fold it away again. The right eyes didn't belong to City Hall, not at first. They belonged to Elena Morales, a freelance data journalist who rode Samuel's bus twice a week on her way to a co-working space downtown. She noticed things the way Samuel did, patterns hiding inside routines people stopped questioning. She noticed the way the route kept changing without warning, the way stops vanished quietly, no public meeting, no explanation, the way riders complained, then adapted, then stopped asking. One evening, Eleanor boarded to find Samuel staring at a folded map on the dashboard during his break. Red and blue ink bled through the paper like veins. "That's not the official route map, is it?" she asked lightly. Samuel glanced up, surprised. Most passengers didn't see him until they needed change. "No," he said. "It's the real one." She smiled. "Those are rare." Samuel hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned the map so she could see it. She didn't laugh. She leaned closer. "What do the colours mean?" she asked. Samuel watched her face, not for intelligence, but for patience. He'd learned the difference. "Red is public service cuts," he said. "Blue is private replacements. Green dots are temporary construction detours that never existed." Elena straightened. "You've been tracking this?" "For 8 years," Samuel replied. Her eyebrows lifted, not in disbelief, but in calculation. "Do you have dates?" she asked. Samuel opened his bag and pulled out 3 notebooks, edges frayed, pages dense with handwriting. "I have everything," he said. They talked until the bus schedule forced him to move. That night, Eleanor emailed him from the address on the transit feedback card he kept in his jacket. The subject line read, "I believe you." They met the following Saturday at a public library, neutral ground, quiet enough to think. Samuel brought the full map, spreading it across a long wooden table. Eleanor brought a laptop and a habit of asking questions that sharpened instead of dulled. She didn't assume corruption, she tested it. They overlaid Samuel's route changes with public procurement records, compared service cuts to contract awards, traced shell companies backward until names started repeating, board members, donors, cousins. By the 3rd hour, Eleanor stopped typing. "Sam," she said quietly, "this isn't just bad planning." Samuel nodded. "I know." "This is deliberate," she continued. "They're starving public routes to justify privatization, and the same companies keep winning." Samuel leaned back in his chair, feeling something close to relief. "I tried to tell them," he said. "They laughed." Eleanor looked at him. "That's because you skipped the part they can't ignore." "What part is that?" She tapped the map. "You didn't just notice," she said. "You documented motive." The story took weeks to build. Eleanor verified every claim twice. She interviewed riders, requested records, filed FOIAs that came back heavily redacted, another signal. She matched Samuel's notes to internal memos leaked anonymously once she knew where to look. Samuel didn't rush her. He drove his routes, took notes, answered questions when she had them, corrected her when she misunderstood how buses actually worked. "Planners think in straight lines," he said once. "Streets don't." When the article finally went live, it didn't lead with outrage. It led with the map. A high-resolution scan of Samuel's hand-marked routes sat at the center of the piece. Red and blue lines told a story anyone could see without needing jargon. The headline didn't mention corruption. It asked a question: why do public bus routes keep disappearing, and who replaces them? By noon, City Hall phones were ringing. By evening, transit officials were issuing statements about misinterpretations and complex funding structures. By morning, an ethics committee announced a preliminary review. Samuel read the article at his kitchen table, coffee cooling beside him. His phone buzzed constantly. Co-workers, riders, strangers thanking him. Someone had left a note on his bus that read, "You were right." He folded it carefully and tucked it into his notebook. They had laughed at the bus driver because they thought knowledge flowed one way, from offices to streets. They didn't understand that repetition creates expertise, that driving the same route for decades teaches you where power moves and who benefits when it does. And now that the map was public, the laughter was gone. What replaced it was much louder. Questions. The city responded the way it always did when the story got ahead of the spin. Slowly, carefully, and just loudly enough to sound in control. A press conference was called 2 days after Eleanor's article went viral. The Transit Commissioner stood behind a podium flanked by flags and carefully neutral language. He spoke about legacy infrastructure challenges, about innovative partnerships, about balancing fiscal responsibility with rider needs. He did not mention Samuel Price, not once. Inside the Transit Authority, however, everything shifted. Emails circulated marked confidential, meetings were rescheduled behind closed doors. A consulting firm was brought in to audit procurement processes, which mostly meant figuring out how exposed they were. People who had laughed in that small conference room suddenly stopped making eye contact with Samuel in the halls. He noticed. Because when you've spent years invisible, you feel the moment you become inconvenient. Samuel was called into his supervisor's office the following week. The supervisor, newer, younger, nervous, folded his hands like he was about to deliver bad news that wasn't his fault. "Sam," he began, "we've had some questions come down from downtown." Samuel nodded. "About the map." The supervisor blinked. "You know about that?" Samuel gave a small smile. "I drew it." There was a pause, then a sigh. "They want to know if you shared internal information," the supervisor said carefully. Samuel shook his head. "I shared what I saw. From the street." "That's the problem," the supervisor muttered under his breath. Officially, Samuel was placed on temporary administrative leave pending review. Unofficially, he was being sidelined, kept away from routes, away from riders, away from the very repetition that had given him clarity in the first place. They told him it wasn't punishment. They never do. Elena called him that night. "They're trying to freeze you out," she said. "That's a response." Samuel sat at his kitchen table, map spread open again, the same way it had been hundreds of nights before. "They can't unsee it," he said. "That's what matters." More stories followed. Other journalists picked up the thread, tracing similar patterns in neighbouring cities. Advocacy groups requested the same procurement data Eleanor had used. Transit workers, drivers, dispatchers, maintenance crews started coming forward quietly. "Sam's not wrong," one anonymous source told a local station. "We've been saying this for years. We just didn't have the map." City Council announced hearings. This time, Samuel was invited. The room was larger than the conference room where he'd been laughed at. Cameras lined the back wall. Council members sat in a semicircle, expressions ranging from attentive to defensive. The Transit Commissioner avoided looking at Samuel altogether. When Samuel took the seat at the witness table, the clerk asked him to state his name and occupation. "Samuel Price," he said into the microphone. "City bus driver, Route 14. That got a few raised eyebrows. "Mr. Price," the council chair said, "can you explain how you compiled the information in your map?" Samuel took a breath. He didn't rush. "I drove the same routes for 30 years, he said. "I noticed what changed and what didn't. I wrote it down. Every time a route was cut, I marked it. Every time a private company showed up where public service disappeared, I marked that too. I added dates, compared announcements to what actually happened." He unrolled the map across the table. Gasps rippled softly through the room. "Is this official data?" a council member asked. "No," Samuel replied. "It's better. It's consistent." The commissioner finally spoke. "With respect," he said, "this map reflects one individual's interpretation." Samuel met his gaze. "Then explain why it matches your contracts," he said. Silence. A councilwoman leaned forward. "Mr. Price, did anyone ever ask you for this information before the article?" Samuel thought of the laughter, the smiles, the phones being checked. "Yes," he said. "Once. They didn't listen." That line made the evening news. Over the next month, subpoenas were issued. Procurement officers were questioned. One private transit contractor abruptly withdrew from bidding on future routes. Another quietly dissolved, its shell companies unravelling under scrutiny. Samuel remained on leave, but something unexpected happened. Riders organised. They showed up to council meetings holding printed copies of the map. They taped it to bus stops. They shared stories of missed shifts, longer commutes, neighbourhoods hollowed out by temporary cuts. The map stopped being Samuel's. It became public memory. One afternoon, Samuel received a letter from the Transit Authority. His leave was lifted. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a line about reassignment pending restructuring. Samuel folded the letter and placed it beside the notebooks. He wasn't angry, because power revealing itself always came with noise, and the noise now was coming from the right direction. They had laughed at the bus driver because they thought Insight required clearance and credentials. They hadn't understood that corruption leaves tracks, and no one sees tracks better than someone who drives the same route every day, refuses to forget what used to be there, and writes it down when everyone else is too busy laughing. The map was no longer something they could roll up and dismiss. It was guiding the investigation now, and the next stop was closer than they thought. The verdict didn't arrive with sirens. It came quietly, buried in agendas and legal language, the way accountability often does when it finally shows up late. The city's independent audit confirmed what Samuel's map had already proven. Public transit routes were systematically reduced in specific neighbourhoods to justify emergency contracts with private operators. Those operators, in turn, were linked, through layers of shell companies and donors, to officials inside the Transit Authority. No one used the word corruption at first. They said conflict of interest, they said procedural failures, they said oversight gaps. But people understood. 2 procurement officers resigned, effective immediately. One senior administrator was placed on leave, then quietly removed. Contracts worth millions were frozen pending review. A state-level investigation opened shortly after, once federal transportation funds were found to be involved. The laughter was gone now, replaced by silence thick enough to feel. Samuel returned to work on a Monday morning like any other. Same bus, same route, different looks. Passengers nodded at him with recognition now. Some said, "Thank you," out loud. One woman handed him a folded newspaper with his photo above the headline and whispered, "You did right." Samuel tucked it into his bag and kept driving. At City Hall, the council passed new transparency measures, public route change dashboards, mandatory impact hearings, independent rider review boards. None of it mentioned Samuel by name. None of it had to, because everyone in the room knew where it had started. A few weeks later, Eleanor called him again. "They want you on a panel," she said. "Transit reform. Experts." Samuel smiled faintly. "I'm not an expert." "You mapped the whole thing," she replied. "That's expertise." Samuel thought about it for a moment. "I'll come," he said, "but I'm not wearing a suit." The panel was streamed online. Academics spoke, consultants spoke, officials spoke carefully. When it was Samuel's turn, he didn't bring slides. He brought the map. He laid it across the table and said one sentence. "This is what happens when decisions don't touch the ground." No applause, no argument, just nods. Months later, Samuel's route was restored fully. Not just his, others too. Stops reappeared. Schedules stabilized. Riders felt the difference before any report said they should. One evening, as Samuel pulled into the depot at the end of his shift, his supervisor approached him quietly. "They're creating a new role," the man said. "Community transit liaison. They want someone who actually understands the routes." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They asked if you'd consider it." Samuel looked back at his bus, at the steering wheel worn smooth by decades of hands, at the seat molded to his weight, at the mirror that let him see everything behind him. "I'll think about it," he said. That night, Samuel spread the map across his kitchen table one last time. The red lines no longer bled forward. The blue ones stopped expanding. For the first time in years, the city looked quieter. He rolled the map up slowly and placed it in the closet, not because it was finished, but because its job, for now, was done. They had laughed at the bus driver because they believed power lived in offices and decisions flowed downward. They learned the hard way that power also lives in repetition, in attention, in someone who sees the same streets every day and refuses to accept that disappearance is accidental. His route map exposed the corruption, but what it really exposed was something far more uncomfortable, that the truth had been driving past them every morning, and they just hadn't bothered to look out the window.